In 1986, a bright teen girl vanishes after a routine job interview at a local print shop. Nearly 2 decades later, her long-lost resume turns up at an estate sale with a chilling handwritten note on the back. As investigators reopen the cold case, buried secrets, long-forgotten clues, and a dangerous suspect begin to surface, revealing the truth one desperate message was meant to expose. The last time anyone saw Lisa Bramwell, it was a humid Thursday afternoon in the summer of 1986. She'd left her house with her hair tied back in a blue scrunchie, a crisp copy of her resume folded neatly into a school binder, and a quiet excitement in her voice. The print shop was less than 10 minutes away by bike, nestled in a strip of small businesses off Maplewood Avenue, the kind of place where job interviews didn't usually end in mystery. Lisa's mom remembered watching her pedal off from the kitchen window, sunlight flashing off the metal basket she'd insisted on attaching herself. She didn't even say goodbye, just waved, the way teenagers do when they believe nothing bad ever really happens. By 7:00 p.m., dinner had gone cold on the stove. Her father called her name into the backyard, then drove in circles around the neighborhood before they finally went to the police. The officers found Lisa's bike still chained to a post in front of the print shop. The lights inside were off. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Closed early due to outage." No one had seen her go in. No one had seen her leave. For weeks the town searched, drones of volunteers scouring fields, wooded parks, and ditches. Lisa's photo was taped to telephone poles, broadcast on the local evening news, printed in the paper beneath the headline, "Teen Girl Vanishes After Job Interview." The case dragged through the summer like a shadow. Friends were questioned. The print shop owner said he hadn't interviewed her that day. His assistant had been managing things for a few hours before closing. When asked, the assistant claimed he never saw her. The story made sense, but something about it didn't sit right with Lisa's mother. She insisted her daughter would have never skipped that appointment, never gone anywhere else first. As the months passed, tips slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Her parents stopped speaking in complete sentences. A shoebox of letters sat untouched on Lisa's bed for years. And then, 19 years later, her resume resurfaced inside a rusted file cabinet bought at an estate sale 50 miles from where she vanished. On the back, scribbled faintly in pencil and nearly lost to time, were 10 trembling words that would finally break the silence. "Don't trust him. Please tell my mom, L." The print shop still stood on Maplewood Avenue, though the lettering on the window had faded, and the building now housed a vape store and a dry cleaner. When police returned to the address in the spring of 2005, it was mostly for show. They didn't expect to find any useful evidence inside, and they didn't. The original business, Maplewood Print, Copy, had closed more than a decade earlier. The owner, Neil Warner, had died in 1992. But what the resume had done was enough. It cracked open a door, long sealed shut. The case, once boxed and shelved with hundreds of other cold files, was reopened. Technicians re-examined everything: witness statements, photos of Lisa's bike still chained to the post, the interview schedule, even phone call logs from the days surrounding her disappearance. It had been so long that most of the original detectives were gone or had moved on, but 2 remained, both retired, both still haunted. One of them, former Detective Ray Mercer, described Lisa's case as the one that had kept him up most nights well into his 60s. When he got the call, he sat in silence for nearly a full minute before whispering, "She left a note. She actually left a note." What that note suggested was chilling. It wasn't a random attack. Lisa hadn't been snatched from the street or lost in the woods. She had met someone. She had grown afraid. And in what must have been her final lucid moment, she'd written a plea that no one would find for 19 years. Detectives refocused their attention on one man in particular, Greg Hanlon, the assistant manager who had been working at the print shop the day Lisa disappeared. In 1986, he was 22 and newly hired. He'd claimed at the time that Lisa never showed up for her interview, No one had challenged that detail. There were no security cameras, no sign-in sheets, no other interviews scheduled that afternoon. Now, with the note in hand, police wanted to talk to him again. He still lived in the state, a few towns over, working warehouse jobs and living in a small apartment above a liquor store. He had never been charged with anything back then, but he had also never stopped being a quiet presence in the back of investigators' minds. And now they had reason to knock on his door. Greg Hanlon opened the door with a cautious squint, the kind of look someone gives when they expect bad news or a sales pitch. He was thinner than his personnel file suggested, his dark hair now graying at the sides, and his eyes darted quickly between the two detectives standing on his porch. They introduced themselves calmly, mentioned Lisa Bramwell's name, and asked if he remembered working at Maplewood Print Copy in June of 1986. Greg nodded slowly. "Yeah, sure. Long time ago." He scratched his neck and stepped aside, inviting them in with a hesitation that didn't go unnoticed. The apartment smelled faintly of motor oil and stale coffee. Boxes lined one wall, a worn recliner sagged in the corner, and above the kitchen sink hung a faded calendar from the year before. Greg leaned against the counter as they asked their questions. He confirmed again that he'd worked there part-time, mostly afternoons, and that he remembered hearing about Lisa going missing. But when asked directly if she had shown up that day for her interview, he shook his head. "Nah, I was waiting, but she never came. Boss was out sick. I closed up early." It was the same answer he'd given 19 years earlier. But this time, detectives had the resume. They mentioned the estate sale, the file cabinet, the note written in Lisa's handwriting. Greg's lips parted just slightly, and his fingers tightened around the rim of his coffee mug. "A note?" he asked. "I don't know anything about that." He was careful with his words, too careful. When asked if he ever met Lisa outside of work, or if he might have spoken with her by phone before the interview, he paused just long enough for the moment to stretch uncomfortably. "I might have called her to confirm the time, maybe. It's been a long time." His answers weren't enough to hold him, but they were enough to raise flags. After the detectives left, one of them leaned against the car and exhaled deeply. There had been no signs of guilt on the surface. But just beneath it, in the small cracks between words and memory, something was off. The kind of off that makes your skin crawl. Lisa's note had said not to trust him. And now, with fresh eyes, they were starting to understand why. Lisa Bramwell had been careful, maybe even too careful. Her parents remembered how she'd rehearsed answers in front of the bathroom mirror the night before the interview, how she'd ironed her blouse twice and taped the corners of her resume folder to keep it from bending. She was nervous but excited, ready to earn her own spending money for the summer. It wasn't just about the job. It was about proving something to herself, that she could step into adulthood with confidence and self-respect. Her mother had snapped a photo that morning, Lisa standing on the porch with her binder clutched tight and her bike helmet dangling from one hand, smiling without a trace of fear. The print shop had seemed like a safe bet. Small business, just off the main road, recommended by her school's career counselor. Lisa had written the number on a sticky note near the phone and scheduled her interview after school hours. What no one knew until years later was that she'd made a second call the day before, the one that connected her with Greg Hanlon. Phone records from 1986 were limited, but the original investigators had jotted down something strange in the margins. A brief, one-minute call from the Bramwell house to the shop outside normal business hours. It hadn't seemed meaningful at the time, but now it suggested Lisa may have spoken to Greg directly. That detail reopened an old conversation. Back in the weeks after Lisa vanished, her best friend Andrea had told police that Lisa seemed uneasy about something. Not frightened exactly, but guarded. Andrea had mentioned it during a third interview, almost as an afterthought. Lisa said the guy on the phone was kind of weird, but she didn't want to be rude. That comment had slipped through the cracks, buried under stacks of more urgent leads. Now, nearly 2 decades later, Andrea was tracked down again. She still lived in Michigan, had 2 kids of her own, and remembered Lisa like it was yesterday. When asked about the phone call, her voice trembled slightly. She didn't say much, Andrea recalled, just that he sounded too eager, like he kept laughing at stuff that wasn't funny. That memory, once dismissed, now hit with the weight of a warning. Lisa had noticed something, and for a brief moment she'd tried to say it aloud. When the news broke about the resume, it spread quickly through the small Michigan town Lisa had once called home. For many, it was a jarring reminder of a story they thought had quietly faded into history. For others, especially those who had known her, it stirred something deeper, a raw ache that had never quite settled. Lisa hadn't just disappeared. She'd vanished in broad daylight, in a place that was supposed to be safe. And now, nearly 2 decades later, her voice had re-emerged in 10 desperate words scrawled on the back of a resume no one even knew she'd carried. Detectives began reaching out to former employees and neighbors connected to the print shop. Most were scattered, retired, or hard to track down. But one name came up twice during background interviews: Carla Winthrop, a receptionist who had worked at the front desk during the summer of 1986. She had left the job just weeks after Lisa disappeared, moved to Indiana, and hadn't been contacted in the original investigation. When they reached her by phone, her voice went quiet when she heard Lisa's name. She paused, then admitted she'd been expecting a call like this for a long time. Carla remembered Lisa. Not from the day she vanished, but from the phone call the week before. Lisa had called asking to confirm the interview time. Carla said she transferred the call to Greg Hanlon, who had been in the back room at the time. She didn't think anything of it, just another high school girl looking for summer work. But later that day, Greg had said something that struck her as odd. "She sounded cute," he'd muttered with a little smirk. Carla had rolled her eyes, chalked it up to immature flirtation, and moved on. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and a haunting sense of guilt, Carla's recollection added weight to the growing suspicions around Greg. Her story matched Andrea's. Both described Lisa as wary but not alarmed, unsettled but still committed to showing up. That was the part that lingered with detectives the most. Lisa knew something felt off, but she went anyway. She showed up with her resume in hand, probably telling herself she was imagining things, that everything would be fine. It wasn't. And 19 years later, the smallest of details were finally beginning to light the path she had once walked alone. By early summer of 2005, the Lisa Bramwell case was no longer just a whisper among locals or a dusty folder in a storage room. It had momentum again, and with it came a quiet urgency. Investigators began revisiting records that hadn't been opened in years, hoping something, anything, had been overlooked. One of the boxes contained a warped 3-ring binder from the original search effort, filled with handwritten logs and neighborhood canvassing notes. Most were routine: dates, addresses, times of interviews. But near the back was a folded sheet labeled "Interview Schedule, June 12, 1986. Typed neatly in columns were names, contact numbers, and appointment slots. At 3:00 p.m., written clearly, was Lisa Bramwell. Next to her name was a set of small initials. G.H. Investigators stared at the letters. It was the first physical indication that Greg Hanlon had in fact interacted with Lisa that day, something he'd denied more than once, including during his recent interview. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to raise questions, enough to start threading his story apart. They brought the log to Lisa's parents, now living in a smaller home just outside town. Her mother ran her fingers across the paper like she was touching something sacred. The time slot had always haunted her. She remembered looking at the clock that afternoon, knowing Lisa would be halfway through her interview. For years she had imagined what might have happened in those missing minutes. Now, seeing it documented confirmed what she had feared all along: Lisa had made it inside. Detectives returned to Greg's apartment for follow-up. This time, they brought the interview schedule and gently confronted him with the inconsistency. Greg's jaw tightened. He stared at the paper a long while before finally saying he didn't remember writing those initials. "Could have been for something else," he mumbled. But the words rang hollow. Even he didn't sound convinced. When pressed further, he became defensive, said he had nothing to hide, said the cops were wasting time digging up old ghosts. But ghosts have a way of lingering. And now, with Lisa's own handwriting pointing directly at him, the story he had clung to for 19 years was starting to buckle. What once looked like a vague memory was becoming a timeline. What once passed as coincidence was starting to feel like a confession. The estate sale where Lisa's resume surfaced had seemed unremarkable at first. A small farmhouse, pale blue with peeling shutters, sat quiet off a back road near Lake Leelanau. The man who had lived there, Joseph Hanlon, passed away in early spring, leaving behind decades of tools, rusted furniture, and file cabinets packed with forgotten paper. Ruth Delaney had wandered through the sale mostly out of curiosity. She had no idea the file cabinet she purchased for $20 would hold the key to one of Michigan's longest-running missing persons cases. Now investigators wanted to understand how that cabinet ended up in Joseph Hanlon's home. The connection was immediate and troubling. Joseph was Greg Hanlon's uncle. In 1986, Greg had been staying with him off and on during a rough patch with his parents. His name never came up in the estate inventory, and yet Lisa's resume had somehow found its way into Joseph's home, hidden behind a drawer in a cabinet filled with old invoices and farm receipts. Detectives drove out to the property. The house had been cleaned out, but the land remained untouched. Several acres of thick woods behind a rusted wire fence, bordered by state forest. Behind the house sat a detached garage and, just beyond that, something more unexpected. A small, weathered outbuilding no larger than a tool shed, its roof half collapsed, ivy crawling up the sides. When officers pried open the door, the air inside was stale and heavy with rot. Dust floated in rays of afternoon light cutting through the gaps in the roof. The floor was dirt, hard-packed and uneven, but something about it felt disturbed. They brought in cadaver dogs the next day. Within minutes, one of the dogs sat at the edge of the clearing, nose to the ground, tail stiff. A second dog echoed the alert. It didn't confirm anything yet, but it pointed them toward the possibility that Lisa Bramwell had been here. A place she never should have known, on land that wasn't hers, tied directly to the only man who had ever denied seeing her. The file cabinet hadn't just preserved her message, it had drawn a map. And slowly, the story she had been unable to tell was being pieced together, not in words, but in soil, in silence, and in the secrets of an old wooden shed. The soil behind the shed was dense with pine roots and old leaves, the kind of earth that resisted shovels and kept its secrets buried deep. Forensic teams marked off a wide perimeter and began the careful, deliberate process of excavation. They started with surface brush, documenting every inch, taking photos from overhead and angles that caught even the smallest shifts in color or texture. Then they worked their way down, inch by inch, through layers of time compacted by weather and seasons and silence. It didn't take long to find something. Just beneath the topsoil, near the base of a bent sapling, was a fragment of cotton fabric caught in a tangle of roots. Pale blue, almost faded to gray, it looked like the kind of blouse worn in the mid-'80s. Less than 2 feet away, a small plastic button, cracked but intact. The team paused. That single piece of material told them they were in the right place. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. These were Lisa's things. Over the next few days, more evidence surfaced. Partial remains, scattered but consistent with how a shallow grave would shift over time, were collected and sent for analysis. Alongside them were rusted hairpins, the kind sold in corner pharmacies during the '80s, and a single sneaker half consumed by the earth. The shoe matched what Lisa's mother remembered her wearing that day, a white Keds tennis shoe with a blue stripe along the heel. Back in town, news of the discovery spread quickly. Reporters gathered outside the sheriff's office while locals left flowers on Lisa's old street corner. Her parents, contacted by investigators with cautious, deliberate words, were asked to provide DNA samples for confirmation. They already knew it was her. A mother knows. Her father said nothing for a long time, just stared out the window while his hand rested flat on the table. There was heartbreak in the confirmation, but there was also something else, relief. Not the kind that erases grief, but the kind that quiets a certain scream inside the heart. Lisa had finally been found. Not wandering, not vanished, not some ghost clinging to rumor. She had been here this whole time, waiting in the ground behind a shed. And now, at last, someone had come for her. The resume had always felt like the beginning of something, but now, with Lisa's remains confirmed, it was clear it had also been her final plea. Investigators sent the document to a specialized forensic lab to preserve what they could. The pencil markings, though faint, were carefully scanned and digitally enhanced. Every smudge, every pressure point, every indent was studied under magnification. What they found beneath the surface of the note surprised even the most seasoned technicians. Using oblique lighting and spectral imaging, analysts discovered a second, shallow indentation beneath Lisa's written message. It had been pressed through another sheet of paper that had once rested on top, long since removed. It wasn't legible at first glance, just the faintest shadows of graphite, but with digital mapping, a single line began to take shape. Not a sentence, not a complete thought, just a name, Greg H. It was the missing thread, the final link between Lisa and the man who had claimed he never saw her. Her handwritten warning had pointed investigators in his direction, but this was something more, an imprint, literally, of what was left unsaid. A name not written for show, but pressed by force or repetition, possibly while Lisa tried to decide what to write. It told them that Greg Hanlon wasn't just a suspicion, he was someone she had actively feared. Detectives reviewed Greg's timeline again. The day Lisa disappeared, he had no confirmed alibi between 2:45 and 5:15 p.m. His supervisor was homesick, the shop closed early, and no customers came in during that window according to what records remained. He had been alone, free to do anything, to take her from the shop, to drive her to the farmhouse he had access to make her vanish without leaving a trace. Back in his apartment, Greg was brought in for another interview, this time under more formal scrutiny. The questions came sharper now, more direct. When presented with the enhanced image of the indent bearing his name, he stared at it for a long time before finally looking up and muttering that he had nothing to do with any of it. But the words sounded hollow, like someone reading a line from memory rather than speaking from truth. The story he'd clung to for 19 years was crumbling. And in its place, the truth was beginning to surface, one name, one note, 1 inch of faded paper at a time. There was a shift in the room during Greg Hanlon's third interview, the kind detectives recognize not from what's said, but from what's no longer being carefully hidden. He sat slouched in his chair, hands folded in his lap, glancing up only when pressed. They had already shown him the logbook with his initials beside Lisa's name, already confronted him with the cabin and the shallow grave, and now they had the forensic image, the shadow of his name, pressed into paper by Lisa herself. He didn't deny that the shed once belonged to his uncle. He admitted to staying there briefly the summer Lisa disappeared, said he used it to store some tools and boxes while between places. But when asked how Lisa's resume could have ended up in a file cabinet in that same shed, he shook his head slowly, muttering that he had no idea. There was no outrage in his denial, no disbelief. Just a tired, mechanical insistence that he couldn't explain any of it. It was the kind of lie that didn't bother trying to convince anyone anymore. After the interview, investigators revisited old witness statements with a new lens. One in particular stood out, a brief note written in July of 1986 by a woman named June Talley, who worked at the bakery next door to the print shop. At the time, she had told police that she saw a girl who looked like Lisa come out of the alley between the two buildings just before 3 o'clock. She had been walking quickly, head down, holding something against her chest. The note had been filed away with dozens of other weak leads, never followed up. Now, nearly 2 decades later, detectives reached out to June, who still lived in the area. She remembered that day clearly. Not because of Lisa, she admitted, but because the power had gone out and she had to throw out all the pies in the display case. When asked again about the girl, she nodded slowly. She was alone, she said, looked nervous, like she was trying not to cry. That small, forgotten observation slid into place like a puzzle piece. Lisa had made it out of the shop, or at least tried to. But something, or someone, had followed, and somewhere between that alley and the rest of her life she disappeared. As detectives kept digging into Greg Hanlon's past, a troubling pattern began to emerge, one that hadn't been visible back in 1986, but was impossible to ignore now. After the print shop closed in the early 90s, Greg bounced between jobs, mostly in low-level positions with limited supervision. Warehouse work, maintenance gigs, a short stint at a car wash in Muskegon. Nothing remarkable on paper, but behind the scenes, a different story began to take shape. In 1993, a co-worker at the warehouse where Greg worked had filed a complaint. She claimed he followed her to her car after a late shift and made her feel unsafe. No physical contact, just words that crossed a line and a presence that lingered too long in the dark. The complaint was noted, but never escalated. 2 years later, a high school intern at a different company reported that Greg made her uncomfortable during training, often standing too close, asking personal questions, once offering her a ride home that she declined. Again, no charges. Again, no follow-up. Individually, none of these incidents were enough to build a case. But together, they formed a pattern, one of predatory behavior just below the threshold of criminal prosecution, protected by a lack of hard evidence and a culture of silence. He was careful, always just within the limits of deniability, but that was the same tactic he had used in Lisa's case. No witnesses, no confrontation, just gaps in time and space that could be explained away if you spoke calmly enough. Detectives brought these records to the district attorney, who reviewed them alongside the evidence from the resume and the forensic data from the shed. While not enough for an immediate arrest, they were starting to build something stronger than suspicion, a profile, a history, and a timeline that, for the first time in nearly 20 years, made sense. Lisa hadn't been random. She had been selected, contacted, observed. Greg Hanlon had crossed paths with her before the interview and possibly again after she tried to leave. Her note wasn't the act of a girl panicking in the dark. It was deliberate, quiet, final. She had written his name, even if only in pressure. And, in doing so, she gave investigators a thread strong enough to follow, one that was finally tightening around the truth. At the heart of the reopened case was one simple detail that had gone overlooked in 1986, a slim, spiral-bound notebook kept behind the front counter at Maplewood Print Copy. It had been used to jot down interview appointments, customer pickups, and staff notes. When police first searched the store after Lisa disappeared, they photographed everything in plain view, including the notebook. But they never examined it closely, assuming it held nothing relevant. Now, with fresh eyes and forensic tools, the notebook was retrieved from storage and given a second look. A lab technician flipped through each page, treating them with ultraviolet light to pick up erased or faded entries. And there, tucked between a lunch reminder and a toner order, was a short handwritten note from June 12, 1986. It read, "Lisa Bramwell, 3 p.m., GH okayed." The ink had bled faintly into the paper fibers, but it was clear. The initials matched the ones next to her name in the typed schedule. This wasn't just a reminder, it was a confirmation. Greg had acknowledged the interview, logged it in the book, and, for reasons that remained his alone, later denied she had ever arrived. This entry was different from the others. Most names were followed by a check mark or crossed out when the appointment was completed. Lisa's name was left untouched. No check, no cancellation. Just an open space frozen in time. It was as if everything that should have followed her name never happened. The quiet around that missing checkmark spoke louder now than any denial Greg had offered in interviews. The notebook was brought into the formal case file and presented to the prosecutor's team, who were now working side by side with cold case detectives. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was stacking, piece by piece, item by item, into a timeline that showed intent, opportunity, and deception. Lisa's family was updated privately. Her mother listened without interrupting, clutching a scarf that had once belonged to her daughter, lips pressed thin, nodding as each new fact was explained. After a pause, she asked softly, "So she was really there, wasn't she?" The lead detective answered yes, and with that, a truth long buried under dust and silence had finally begun to rise. Lisa had walked through that door, and someone had made sure she didn't walk back out. The search of the farmhouse property had extended beyond the old shed now. Investigators knew that if Greg Hanlon had hidden Lisa's body in a shallow grave, he might have also hidden other things, items too incriminating to leave behind, but too personal to destroy. It wasn't uncommon for perpetrators to keep objects connected to their victims. A trophy, a memento, sometimes nothing more than a scrap of fabric or a lock of hair. Not for nostalgia, but for control. A way to revisit the moment on their terms. The team returned to the crawl space beneath the farmhouse itself, which had previously been too unstable for entry. With structural supports in place, they eased into the tight, musty space with flashlights and masks, crawling over rotting insulation and spiderwebs that clung to the ceiling beams. Near the back wall, buried beneath loose dirt and mouse-nested debris, they found a dented tin box. Inside were 4 items: a cassette tape, a receipt from a gas station in Benzie County, a yellowed Polaroid of the print shop's front counter, and a folded page torn from a teenage diary. The handwriting was small and careful, unmistakably Lisa's. The page read like an entry written in private, never meant to be seen. She had written about the upcoming interview, about how someone from the shop had called her to confirm the time. "He seemed too friendly," she wrote. "Kept calling me sweetheart. I told Andrea, but she says I'm probably just being paranoid." Investigators read the entry in silence. There was no signature, no mention of Greg by name, but there didn't need to be. The voice was Lisa's, and the unease was clear. She had noticed something. And despite brushing it off in her writing, she hadn't forgotten it. She had carried that worry into the shop with her and, most likely, into the shed where her life ended. The receipt and photo gave detectives new places to investigate, and the tape, though badly degraded, was sent to a forensic audio lab in the hope that something might be salvaged. But even without it, they had enough. These weren't random things. These were pieces of her final days, collected and hidden by the one man who kept denying he ever met her. What he left behind in that box said more than he ever would, and what Lisa left behind was finally being heard. The Polaroid taken of the front counter at Maplewood Print copy looked ordinary at first, grainy, slightly overexposed, with a time stamp faded at the bottom. But when investigators studied it closely, something caught their attention. In the far corner of the frame, behind the register, a reflection was visible in the glass display case. It was partial, just the side of a face and shoulder, but it didn't belong to the owner, Neil Warner. When compared to an old staff photo taken for the shop's holiday newsletter in 1986, the features matched Greg Hanlon. What made it significant wasn't just his presence, but what he was wearing. The striped flannel shirt matched the one described by June Talley, the bakery employee who saw a man following a girl that looked like Lisa into the alley behind the shop. It was circumstantial, but layered with the timeline and Lisa's note, it was starting to form a picture that was hard to ignore. At the forensic lab, technicians were able to recover part of the cassette tape. Most of it was warped by heat and time, but 10 seconds of faint audio remained. The voices were low and distorted, but one sounded young, female, uncertain. It was impossible to confirm if it was Lisa, and the words couldn't be made out clearly. Still, the sound alone, the tone of fear in it, was enough to shake the team listening. The audio was sealed and logged, another piece of a puzzle coming together not in a single moment, but through slow, careful work built on decades of silence. Back in town, Lisa's parents were shown the diary page. Her mother traced the ink with trembling fingers, recognizing the way her daughter curved her y's and looped her g's. She remembered Lisa calling the man sweetheart in that sarcastic way only teenage girls can pull off, then brushing it aside with a shrug. "She always wanted to seem tough," her mother said quietly, "but I could tell when something bothered her." That page, found hidden in a tin box beneath rotted floorboards, was the last unfiltered glimpse of Lisa as she was. Brave, cautious, and still trying to convince herself it would all be okay. But the man she had worried about hadn't let her go. He had kept her things, he had kept her memory locked in silence. And now, all of it was surfacing, one artifact at a time. When news of the tin box made its way through law enforcement circles, it sparked renewed attention from the district attorney's office. The evidence was circumstantial, yes, but increasingly consistent. A handwritten note, a hidden diary page, a Polaroid with a matching shirt, and a series of quiet but disturbing complaints from women who had crossed paths with Greg Hanlon in the years after Lisa vanished. Each piece by itself might have been dismissed. But together they formed a grim mosaic, one that told a story Lisa hadn't lived to finish but had still managed to leave behind. Detectives turned their attention to the gas station receipt found in the box. It was dated the same day Lisa disappeared, June 12, 1986, time stamped at 4:06 p.m. in Benzie County, roughly 45 minutes from the print shop. Greg had never mentioned being there. In fact, during initial questioning all those years ago, he told police he closed up shop and went home around 3:30. Now, the receipt placed him far outside of town at a critical moment, along a route that could have taken him to his uncle's property. The date, time, and location aligned with the growing theory that Lisa had been taken quickly, possibly even minutes after leaving the alley, and driven out of town before anyone had time to raise alarm. They tracked down archived surveillance logs from the station, hoping against odds that anything from that day had been saved or recorded. Nothing remained. But they did find a former employee, now in her 60s, who remembered the receipt's paper design. It had been used only briefly due to a printing error, which helped verify its authenticity. The gas station had also been one of the few in the area that required attendants to pump gas back then. The woman, Darlene, didn't remember the specific car or man from that day, but she did recall something strange that month: a teenage girl in the passenger seat of a brown sedan, slumped low, looking pale. She thought the girl might have been sick or asleep. The detail had never been reported, and Darlene had never connected it to the missing girl until now. She looked down at the receipt the detective showed her and nodded once. "It might have been her," she said quietly. "But I didn't know what I was seeing." Few people did, not until it was far too late. The weight of evidence was growing heavier by the day. Detectives had enough threads to form a picture, and while none of them individually sealed the case, together they carried the undeniable shape of a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. They turned back to Greg Hanlon one more time, not with accusations, but with the kind of methodical pressure that slowly closes in, quiet and unshakable. This time they brought everything. The resume with Lisa's plea, the initials in the logbook, the receipt from Benzie County, the diary page in her own handwriting, the Polaroid, and the shallow grave. He didn't look at most of it. He kept his eyes on the table, hands folded neatly like he was sitting through a test he already knew he would fail. They asked again about the day Lisa went missing. Greg repeated what he had always said, that he never saw her, that she must have changed her mind or gone somewhere else. But the words lacked any weight now. They were just dust over bone. One detective leaned forward, voice calm, and asked about the gas station. Greg's left hand twitched slightly, a reflex more than a response. He said he didn't remember going out there, couldn't recall anything about that day in detail. They told him the station kept logs, that a girl matching Lisa's description was seen in a brown sedan just after 4. Still, he said nothing useful. They didn't expect a confession. They knew by now that Greg wasn't the kind to break suddenly. But they were watching his tells, the way his voice lowered, the way his shoulders curled inward, how his gaze drifted toward the photo of the shed when he thought no one was looking. There was fear there, buried under years of practiced deflection, and under that fear was something closer to resignation, like a man who knew the world was finally catching up. Back at the station, as the interview ended, one officer said quietly that it wasn't just the note that mattered, it was the fact that Lisa had written it at all. She'd sensed something, she'd acted. And in doing so, she had laid the first stone in the path that was now circling back to justice. Whether Greg admitted it or not, her voice had endured. It had waited 19 years, but it was speaking louder than ever. In the quiet office, where evidence was reviewed, one item remained in the center of the table long after the others had been filed away. Lisa's resume, creased and yellowing, protected now in a clear archival sleeve, sat under a lamp with its faint, trembling message still legible through the plastic. "Don't trust him. Please tell my mom, Elle." It had been the first thread, the one that changed everything. And now, as prosecutors prepared their case, it remained the clearest artifact of both Lisa's fear and her strength. The assistant district attorney assigned to the case stood over it with a kind of reverence. It was just a sheet of paper, but it had endured almost 2 decades sealed behind a drawer, waiting to be discovered. It had slipped past everyone, movers, estate liquidators, even the original investigators. And yet it had survived, as if Lisa had planted it there for the right person to find when the time was finally ready. The case against Greg Hanlon was growing. The gas station receipt alone put him in the right place at the right time. The recovered items from the tin box hinted at a need to preserve and control details that only the perpetrator would possess. The reflection in the Polaroid placed him inside the print shop that afternoon, wearing a shirt that matched an eyewitness account. And the interview schedule, handwritten initials beside Lisa's name, contradicted every denial he had repeated for 19 years. But what carried the most weight was the pattern. He hadn't just vanished from the scene. He had lived in the shadows of suspicion ever since, avoiding long-term jobs, moving frequently, leaving just enough behind to avoid questions, but never enough to seem stable. The small complaints from women, the discomfort they described, the way he always hovered just outside the boundaries of consequences, it all came together like a soft drumbeat behind every fact. Lisa had left the print shop that day, afraid but not silent. She wrote her fear down. She named it. She tried to get it home to her mother in the only way she could. And that message, faded but unbroken, had held steady against time. What she could not outrun, she had tried to outsmart. And now, after all these years, the world was finally catching up to the truth she had never stopped trying to tell. Greg Hanlon's story was unraveling quietly, but with a steady grip. Investigators had never expected a confession, not from someone who had kept a lie alive for nearly 2 decades. But the weight of evidence was finally forcing pieces into alignment. Witnesses who had once hesitated were now returning calls. Old documents, overlooked or misplaced, were being pulled from archives and re-examined. One in particular came from a nearby print supply vendor, an invoice dated June 13, 1986, showing a delivery made to the farmhouse address listed under Joseph Hanlon, Greg's uncle. The time of delivery, 9:40 a.m. The driver's note. No one answered. Left package in shed. It was a seemingly minor detail, but it placed Greg at that property again, within 24 hours of Lisa's disappearance. What mattered more was the timing. If Lisa had been taken to that shed the afternoon before, and if Greg had returned the next morning before authorities even knew she was missing, it meant he had time to cover tracks, hide evidence, and returned to his routine with no one the wiser. When detectives spoke with the delivery driver, now retired, he didn't recall the interaction but confirmed that the route and stop matched his schedule from that era. The shed, he added, had creeped him out at the time. Dark, quiet, felt wrong, he said. He didn't linger. As the case tightened, one final piece came from someone no one expected. A caretaker who had maintained Joseph Hanlon's property in the early 90s came forward. He remembered seeing Greg at the farmhouse regularly in the years after Lisa vanished, often alone, sometimes unloading boxes into the shed. When pressed, he recalled one afternoon when Greg asked him not to mow behind the shed line, saying the ground was soft from an old septic tank. The caretaker had followed instructions, but always thought it strange. There was no tank listed on the property plans. That detail matched the location where Lisa's remains were found. A shallow grave, concealed under years of overgrowth, in the exact area Greg had asked to be left untouched. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic, but it was real. A small, sharp truth tucked beneath a mountain of silence. And with that, the final corner of his story collapsed. He had been there. He had returned. And all along he had counted on the world forgetting. But Lisa had made sure it wouldn't. By the end of the summer in 2005, the pieces had settled into a shape that no one could ignore. Prosecutors, after weeks of meetings and deliberations, issued a warrant for Greg Hanlon's arrest. The charge was murder, based on circumstantial but compelling evidence supported by forensic findings, documented lies, and a pattern of behavior that had stretched across nearly 2 decades. There had been no confession, but Lisa's note, the hidden diary page, the shed, the timeline, and the gas station receipt all pointed to the same conclusion. Greg had taken Lisa from that print shop on June 12, 1986, and he had never intended to let her leave. When they came to his apartment, he didn't resist. He didn't speak. He stood in the doorway in a plain shirt and jeans, looking smaller than he had during his last interview, as if the truth had already begun to strip him down from the inside. Neighbors watched quietly as he was placed in the back of the cruiser. Some had lived beside him for years, never knowing who he really was. Others simply stared, the kind of stare people give when history suddenly folds itself back into the present. Word reached Lisa's parents within the hour. Her father stood motionless for a long time after the call, then finally whispered that he hoped the man dreamed of her face every night. Her mother didn't cry. She'd done all her crying in the years between, in the nights spent wondering what they'd missed, in the silence of birthdays that came and went. This moment wasn't relief exactly, it was something heavier. A kind of peace that came not from healing but from knowing the lie had finally been pulled into the light. The small town where Lisa grew up hadn't forgotten her. Within days of Greg's arrest, flowers began to appear beneath the old maple tree near the corner where she used to wait for the school bus. Pink carnations, handwritten notes, a laminated photo of her smiling beside her bike. Someone even tied a ribbon around the tree trunk with the words, "She told us." For 19 years, Lisa Bramwell had been called a missing person, but now, finally, she had a voice again. And the man who tried to silence her would never outrun what she left behind. The courtroom was small and windowless, with beige walls and rows of wooden benches polished smooth by time. Greg Hanlon sat at the defense table in a pressed shirt, hair combed back, eyes fixed on nothing. He didn't speak. He barely moved. The arraignment was quiet, procedural, but charged with a tension that could be felt in the stillness of the room. Lisa's parents were there, seated just behind the prosecutor, their hands folded together like they had been waiting for this moment, not for weeks, but for years. The charges were read aloud: first-degree murder, unlawful confinement, obstruction of justice, and with each one, Greg blinked but said nothing. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty. Lisa's mother watched him, searching for something in his face: remorse, fear, anger, anything that might have given meaning to the long, silent ache that had taken root in their lives. But there was nothing. Just a man surrounded by evidence he could no longer deny, and a system finally catching up to the damage he had left behind. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered with microphones and cameras, their questions sharp and fast. Most of the town knew Lisa's name. Some had gone to school with her. Others remembered the search parties in the woods, the posters on telephone poles, the way everything had suddenly felt unsafe that summer. Now, almost 20 years later, the story had come back to life, but with an ending that no one could have written back then. A girl lost after an interview, a resume found behind a drawer, and a truth so persistent it refused to stay buried. Prosecutors promised a full trial. They would bring every piece of evidence to the stand: Lisa's note, the recovered items, the timeline, the eyewitnesses who had carried their memories all these years. They wouldn't let her story be reduced to a file number or a headline. She was more than that. She had been a daughter, a friend, a quiet girl with a sharp mind and careful dreams. And now, because she had written a message when no one else could hear her, she was something else too. She was a voice that had pierced through decades of silence, forcing the world to stop and finally listen. As the trial preparations moved forward, investigators and prosecutors worked late into the night, carefully assembling their timeline piece by piece. Each piece of evidence was laid out chronologically, forming the clearest possible picture of what happened to Lisa Bramwell on that quiet June afternoon in 1986. It wasn't just about proving that Greg Hanlon was guilty. It was about honoring Lisa's voice, the one she had risked everything to preserve. They reconstructed the events from the moment she left her house on her bike to the time her belongings were found at the farmhouse nearly 2 decades later. The appointment log, the handwritten initials, the reflection in the Polaroid, the recovered diary page, all supported the conclusion that Lisa had gone to that interview, met Greg, sensed something was wrong, and had still gone through with it. She'd been polite, professional, cautious, and when things began to unravel, when she realized she might not make it out, she used the only weapon she had: her words. That message on the back of her resume was no accident. It wasn't scribbled in fear or confusion. It was written with intention, tucked away where someone might find it if everything else failed. She hadn't screamed into the void. She'd written to be found, and somehow, miraculously, someone had found her. The prosecution planned to open with that note. Not the DNA, not the shed, not even the recovered items. They would start with Lisa's own voice. The courtroom would hear the words she had written to her mother, scratched onto the back of a sheet she had prepared days before, folded carefully and carried with pride into what should have been a simple job interview. Lisa's parents would be present for every step of the trial. Her mother asked that the original copy of the resume remain sealed, not passed around the courtroom, not touched or held up like an exhibit. It wasn't just evidence. It was the last real thing her daughter had ever written, and it had done something that no search party or flyer or news broadcast had been able to do. It had kept her story alive long enough to be told the right way. Not as a mystery, not as a case file, but as a girl who fought to be remembered. The trial began on a gray morning in late October, nearly 20 years to the day after Lisa Bramwell vanished. The courtroom filled with quiet anticipation, the kind of silence that feels more like a collective holding of breath than calm. Reporters occupied the back rows, and every seat was taken. Lisa's parents sat side by side in the front row, hands intertwined, their eyes never leaving the prosecution table. Greg Hanlon entered without looking at the gallery, his shoulders hunched, his face as unreadable as ever. Opening statements were deliberate and somber. The prosecution began not with technical evidence, but with a name: Lisa. They spoke of who she was, what she wanted from life, how she'd prepared for the job interview like it was her first step into adulthood. They showed a photograph of her, taken the morning she left, smiling in the sun with her resume folder tucked under one arm. And then, after a long pause, they displayed a high-resolution image of the message on the back of that resume. "Don't trust him. Please tell my mom." The room went still. Not a cough, not a shuffle. Just that quiet, reverent silence again. Witnesses came and went over the next few days. Former employees from the print shop, the bakery worker who had seen Lisa near the alley, the woman from the gas station, the caretaker from the farmhouse. Each one added another thread to the web prosecutors were weaving, one that placed Lisa at the shop, Greg at the shed, and the lie he had lived inside for nearly 2 decades out in the open. When Lisa's mother was called to the stand, she steadied herself before speaking. She didn't talk about evidence or timelines. She spoke about her daughter's laugh, the way she organized her school notes with color-coded tabs, the way she always made a checklist before doing anything important. She said Lisa had believed in preparation, in doing things right. And so it made perfect sense, she said through tears, that when her daughter realized something terrible was happening, she would find the one thing she still had control over, a sheet of paper and a pencil, and leave behind the one truth that mattered most. She didn't vanish. She was taken. And she did everything she could to come home. The verdict came on the 10th day of the trial after 6 hours of deliberation. The jury returned to the courtroom in near silence, 12 people carrying the weight of a decision that had been almost 20 years in the making. Lisa's parents held hands so tightly that their knuckles were white. The prosecutor stood motionless, his notes unopened on the table. Greg Hanlon sat quietly, expressionless, as if he already knew how this would end. The judge read the verdict slowly, deliberately, letting each word settle before continuing. Guilty on all counts, first-degree murder, unlawful confinement, tampering with evidence. A few quiet gasps slipped from the gallery, and Lisa's mother brought a hand to her mouth, eyes welling with tears that had waited too long to fall. Her father simply bowed his head. There was no outburst, no applause, just a release of something that had sat heavy on so many shoulders for so many years. Greg showed no emotion. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his gaze fixed on the floor. There would be no appeals, no public statements, no attempts to explain away what had been proven beyond doubt. His silence, once a shield, now hung around him like a chain. He had kept his secret buried with Lisa for nearly 2 decades. But she had left just enough behind to drag that secret into the light. After the sentencing, the Bramwells stepped outside into a cold autumn wind. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, but no one spoke. Her mother held a framed copy of the note, not the original, but a replica sealed under glass. "Don't trust him. Please tell my mom." It was the only thing she had ever asked for, and now it had done what no one else could. It had told the truth. The town that had once searched for Lisa and mourned her in silence now honored her with something more lasting than memory. Her name would be etched into a small memorial in the town's park, beside a bench under the old maple tree. A place where people could sit, read her story, and understand that she hadn't disappeared without a trace. She had spoken, and someone had finally listened. In the months following the verdict, the town slowly returned to its rhythm, but something had shifted. Lisa Bramwell's story had left an imprint not just in the court records or headlines, but in the quiet corners of everyday life. At the high school where she would have graduated, a scholarship fund was created in her name, offered each year to a student who showed the same determination and quiet strength Lisa had been known for. Her photo now hung in the main hallway, not as a reminder of what was lost, but of what had endured. Her parents visited the bench often. It was simple, smooth wood, a bronze plaque beneath it, and just a few words, in memory of Lisa Bramwell, who never stopped trying to be heard. Children played nearby. Teenagers leaned on the backrest while scrolling through phones, not all of them knowing the full story, but understanding enough to pause when they read her name. The bench became a place for reflection, not just for what had happened, but for how it had been answered. The resume, the original, with its faint pencil scrawl, was donated to a small museum that focused on unsolved and solved cold cases where it would be preserved behind glass. Not for spectacle, but for education. Visitors came to read the story, to see how one girl's decision to write something down in a moment of fear had broken open a case thought forever cold. Her message wasn't long, it didn't name names or explain everything, but it had been enough. It had cracked through silence, survived dust and time, and reached exactly where it needed to. Lisa had never made it to her first day of work. She never got to ride her bike back home or celebrate her last summer before college, but she had written something that changed everything. And in that act, she became more than a victim in a closed file. She became the reason justice was finally found. Her story didn't end at the print shop, or in the shed, or even in the courtroom. It ended here, with her voice remembered, her truth restored, and a town that would never again take silence for an answer.